Those demanding justice for Michael Brown are relieved that Eric Holder is here because they simply don't trust the local authorities. The Attorney General here on a day that follows a relatively peaceful night, with the hope that Ferguson just may have hit a turning point.
Well, the visit by Attorney General Eric Holder to Ferguson was really an effort by the White House to try to bring back confidence to a community that's just been torn apart.
Eric Holder's message to the people of Ferguson, Missouri: we want to help. During a private meeting Wednesday, he said he understood the black community's mistrust of police and recalled his own experience with racial profiling.
Many here are seeing Holder's presence as a step towards transparency.
A step towards transparency. I'm Ben Swan, filling in for Steve Malzberg. Attorney General Eric Holder, as you saw there, visited Ferguson, Missouri earlier this week. Question though, did he do more harm than good, and what good might he have done? And how about the media's reaction to Ferguson in general? Joining me now to try to answer these questions and much more is Noah Rothman. He is the associate editor for hotair.com. Noah, thanks so much for being with me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about Eric Holder, because obviously he shows up in Ferguson this week. Essentially shook hands with a few people. He didn't show up with, federal police at his side, to fan out and take control of the situation there. But he did show up, and we have seen somewhat of a turning point in terms of this overnight violence. Do you think it did any good?
Yeah, I do think it did a significant amount of good, actually, when it comes to assuaging the concerns of the local population that there was going to be justice done in this case. There's been a lot of demands that there be an arrest made, that Officer Darren Wilson be arrested. We've seen this before. It's very similar to what we saw in Florida after Trayvon Martin was killed, that there was a demand for a new independent prosecutor. It resulted in the appointment of Angela Corey and a demand for an arrest. Now, the arrest didn't end up being enough to assuage the local population. They wanted a conviction. But we are seeing at least some confidence among the local population that this will be adjudicated by federal officials, at least nominally, maybe open up a case in the DOJ Civil Rights Division, and that seems to have calmed some frayed nerves.
Yeah, it's interesting because certainly when we talk about the feds intervening on any level into this kind of a matter, I mean, it does give me pause whenever that happens, because you have to question, well, really, should the feds be there, and what kind of force are they bringing? At the same time, let's face it, I mean, the police there in Ferguson, Missouri have done nothing for their case. They haven't been able to get their story straight for days. They change the story, they give wrong information. I mean, it's been a complete mess in terms of that. Aside from the militarization issue, just these guys getting on the same page has almost been laughable. So, I mean, at some point, I guess you do need to have confidence in some other form of law enforcement, do you not?
Oh, yeah, I completely agree that the majority, I think it's fair to say, it's debatable, but it's fair to say that the majority of this unrest was brought about as a result of the inept behavior of the Ferguson police and the real questionable approach that Governor Jay Nixon has taken to this crisis. I think that that's fair to say that a lot of this wouldn't have occurred with the severity that it did if a different approach had been taken initially. But I think the press has a lot of blame as well by inflating the nature of the allegations against the Ferguson Police Department in a way that I don't think was fair and has resulted in a tainting of the environment, the national political environment, as well as the environment in Ferguson, as far as their approach to this issue and their faith in the local officials.
When you say media, can you define that? Are you talking about, for instance, Al Sharpton going and standing with the family, Don Lemon CNN? What are you talking about specifically? Yeah,
the national political press, primarily the major cable networks. Not even referring to Al Sharpton, who has behaved more in his dual-purpose role as cable news host / activist. He is been more activist than cable news host in this issue, but he does that when it comes to racially charged incidents of violence and court cases. But yeah, you cited Don Lemon, who offered the family his help. He was on the front lines of protests there. He's not alone. There were a lot of people with CNN who were doing the exact same thing. Fox, MSNBC, who were very favorable to the protesters. Chris Hayes got a rock thrown at him. He was forgiving of that particular incident because he, frankly, and quite a lot of the members of the press create the impression that they're far more favorable to the protesters in this incident, in this episode, than they are for the police, and that's frankly not the job. And I think they've got a lot of criticism for that, deserved criticism. But it is a very new role, and most people recognize that it's a new role. They're not sure whether or not it's a valuable role for the press. They have more of an activist position, but there's very little debate that this is not the traditional role that the media plays.
Well, I think everybody wants to be Vice News, is what it comes down to. They want to have that embed feel and that look, and it's like they're all playing catch up. Chris Hayes, probably the best thing that happened to him all week was having that rock thrown at him. Someone saw his clips and watched his show.
You say embed, and that's true, but it's not embed in the traditional sense. We're not embedding with the police, for example, or embedding with the military. We're embedding with the protesters.
Well,
we're on the other side of the line.
It's a faux embed. It's a faux embed, right?
It's point of view. It's a point of view which is very much the protesters' point of view as opposed to the other way around. That started to change toward the end or to the middle part of this week, around Wednesday, Tuesday, when the criticism began to get very heavy. You did see some media outlets begin to adopt the point of view of the National Guard and the Ferguson and the Missouri police, but that was not the case early on, certainly not last week.
And again, there's so much to this story, so many dynamics. It's very easy just to step back and say, let's just focus on the facts. Let's focus on presenting information as news outlets are supposed to do, rather than taking the, again, as you said, the activist role. And I believe that, in terms of journalists, that there is a place for activism, but it certainly is not in the midst of your coverage. To be embedded there. So finally, let me ask you this. Where do you think Ferguson goes from here? We have about a minute left. Where do you think Ferguson goes from here? Will it all continue to die down, or are we going to see this thing flare back up again?
I think it dies down, but this isn't going away. This is going to be, we're going to see the grand jury come out with a report in October. It's going to be a news story for the better part of another year, and it'll finally go to court, most likely, and it may even result in DOJ charges, although we never saw DOJ charges brought against George Zimmerman. There will be an investigation. I suspect it will be an issue for some time, a low-lying issue.
And I would think in this case it would be more likely if we did see those charges simply because of the official nature, the law enforcement nature of the person who may be charged here, as opposed to the civilian aspect in George Zimmerman's case?
Yeah, most likely, because again, this is going to be investigated as a police shooting, which has an entirely different realm than a civilian shooting. So yes, but it'll be background radiation for the better part of a year, I would imagine.
Noah Rothman, thanks so much for being with us. We'll be back with more of Steve Malzberg's show after the break, but first stay tuned for your Newsmax Now update.